Initially, the United States tried to persuade the IOC to move the Games to another country.
There were three proposals: not to stage Olympic Games at all at 1980, or to move Olympic Games from Moscow somewhere to another country, or even to stage Olympic Games in the United States.
It's all very well for Carter to say, well, we'll just move the Games. And they have no idea of the complexity of it. You just can't do it. So we knew that. We also knew that if we caved on that issue, that we would be in the pockets of governments forever.
The International Olympic Committee are unanimous that the Games must be held in Moscow as planned.
The United States does not wish to be represented in a host country that is invading and subjugating another nation.
They were saying and got their athletes to vote in favor of a boycott on the basis of the president's advice to them that the national security of the United States of America was at stake. Arrant nonsense.
I am feeling desperately sorry for the athletes who have been hurt by it.
Olympic dreams were shattered because that was the one opportunity every 4 years, and so when that's taken away, it devastated a lot of careers.
I don't think you ever, in reality, accept anything like that. I think you just adjust to it. We had no recourse. I think the State Department, it got very, very political. It was going to be impossible for any Americans to go to the Games.
It left such a bad taste in my mouth. The boycott was the catalyst for me leaving the sport, going to American football, because we don't boycott American football games.
The situation was not so clear-cut for British athletes.
It was seen as a flagrant act of aggression, and as such it provoked a response simply satisfying public opinion.
Those who believe that sport has nothing to do with politics are living in a dream world.
Mrs. Thatcher appeals again to Britain's athletes: think again about going to Moscow.
As an athlete, even if you didn't want to be embroiled in it, you had no alternative, because once the British government had basically laid down the policy, it became a free-for-all.
We were quite young, and we're having to deal with some pretty difficult situations that most politicians would find tricky.
It's like coming out of the bloody zoo.
I mean, over that winter we saw it unravelling, and we were reading in the papers and actually getting letters from people saying you shouldn't go before the question even begun to arise within the governing body as to whether we should go.
One way to bring home to the Russian people the enormity of what has happened by their government invading Afghanistan is to boycott the Olympic Games.
It was a moral issue, and I thought deeply about what the consequences would be, and I think that the war was going to go on irrespective of whether I went to Moscow or not.
The host country will say, well, they don't care that much. Look, they've sent their athletes here. And equally, in the domestic opinion of your own country, people will say, well, what a weak lot we are. We protest about their invasion of Afghanistan, and yet we've got all these British athletes over there.
I think the most important thing that happened in 1980 was that the British Olympic Association stood up to Margaret Thatcher, to the government, and she said, I don't want the British team to go to the Olympic Games. And my reaction was, well, nobody cares what you say, because you've not been invited to the Olympic Games.
Many athletes felt that sport was being singled out, that it was the only weapon the government was using in its dispute with the Soviet Union.
Are you still hoping to go to Moscow?
That's what I'm training for, and very hard, yes.
I suppose for me the clincher was being told left, right and centre that I really shouldn't be going there. At the same time that the Bolshoi Ballet was arriving in London, and I think an oil pipe contract was being signed with British interests. I think some of us at that point felt, hey, hang on a minute.
It is as essential.
I think we felt very strongly that had the full panoply of measures been taken, of course the sportsmen would have gone along with that.
If anybody in politics ever thought that not sending the British Olympic team to the Olympic Games in Moscow was going to affect the situation in Afghanistan, would have to be foolish.
Despite the opposition and all the pressure, I was part of a British team of sorts that arrived in Moscow for the 22nd Olympic Games. Some individual sports had deferred their decision whether to turn up until the very last minute. Others, like equestrianism, would not come to Moscow at all. But all of us who came had defied the wishes of our government and withstood fierce criticism in the media to be here in communist Russia.
It's difficult to explain just how much this place has changed since 1980. The buildings are pretty much the same, but back then they were grey, the whole place was austere, and it's been replaced with a vibrancy and a brightness that just wasn't around then. And all the symbols of Soviet rule, you know, the big posters of Lenin, and it's all gone.
The flags and things like that were pretty dour colours. You know, the red was pretty dowdy, and the only thing that you could recognise was the black. You know, and you know, but everything seemed to be dull, and there was no smiling faces.
But the security was, I mean, just over the top in every conceivable way. Getting back in and out of the hotel, back in the hotel in the evening, you had to go through the same process. Everything was searched. You were searched, frisked.
When we got to Moscow, we were put into the Cosmos Hotel. Everyone knew it was the media hotel, and that had a KGB group in the basement monitoring us. There's no doubt that every room was wired for sound. We suspect that some were wired for picture as well.
There was, believe it or not, a guy called Boris who used to come in at 4 o'clock every day and fiddle around with the television in our room. And there was nothing wrong with the television.
I always felt in the hotel that the radio had a dual purpose, as it were. You could tune into the radio, but it also seemed to be a listening device. There were times when the radio didn't work, and you could hear these sort of breathing noises in the background. Now, I don't think that's my imagination. It wasn't other people's imagination either. We sometimes, once or twice, sat in the bedroom and used to rail off about the Soviet regime and the Soviet system just to annoy somebody.
The Moscow Olympics had the lowest number of participating nations since 1956. Just 80 nations were present. Many of the Western countries would discard their national flag for the Olympic rings. But this was still supposed to be the greatest show on earth. And our hosts were determined to show the world that they could put on the most impressive Olympics ever.
We wanted to have the largest, the biggest Olympic Games. And each country, and particularly Great Britain, which was a very, very important country from many points of view, and particularly in sport, we're very pleased to have them, in spite of the position of the government.
But for those countries opposed to the Games, little or no publicity of what was happening in the Soviet capital was the goal.
There was no Olympics for us to watch. It wasn't televised. The American network didn't go to cover it. So we had essentially no coverage of the Olympic Games except on the news at night when they recapped the scores. So I didn't see any of it.
We knew that there was pressure from the government, obviously pressure from the government for the athletes not to go, and there was pressure on the BBC for us not to be there.
We were sort of taken to one side and told, look, don't celebrate anything too much, because the British government don't really want us to be there.